Good evening. This is my first ever YouTube lecture, so I hope that you'll forgive me. I've chosen to do this now because November the 5th is coming up, a date that is extremely important in the history of Shakespeare, magic, and also Macbeth. So, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the history of magic and how it relates to the construction of the play Macbeth, how magical traditions influence the play, and how Shakespeare used those magical traditions um, and reworked them. I'm also going to talk a little bit about Halloween because these traditions of ritual magic also influenced Halloween, and Shakespeare's play Macbeth then influenced Halloween. So, what is magic? Well, magic has long been a shorthand for secret or forbidden knowledge, sort of like the apple in the Garden of Eden. Ask any Harry Potter fan, and they can tell you that magic can be seen as a discipline, or a field of study, or an art, as Shakespeare frequently puts it. Um, but that, of course, any form of knowledge can be used for good or for evil. Around the time that Shakespeare wrote Macbeth, there was a radical shift in what magic was, and there was a terrifying crackdown on witchcraft, necromancy, alchemy, divination, and all such forms of magical arts. And that's what we're going to discuss here: how the concept of magic, what it is, evolved from a sort of a religious practice and um, sort of a amalgam of pseudoscience and religious practices to what was firmly conceived as the work of the devil. As I said before, Shakespeare appropriates the symbols and rituals of many pre-Christian cultures into the magic he portrays in Macbeth. And a lot of these pre-Christian cultures embody this in the religious festivals that would also become Halloween. And I would argue that this went full circle. When Shakespeare created the play Macbeth, he also created a lot of traditions that we use at Halloween to this very day. So let's start with the Greeks, because as most students of Western history, um, it's a culture the most familiar to us. Shakespeare's witches are derived from many traditions, but especially the Greeks, who have the ancient Greeks had a lot of myths about seers and fortune tellers, like Cassandra, witches like Medea, who were skilled in poisons. But in addition, there is also the goddess Hecate, who appears as a character in Macbeth. She is the goddess of night and witchcraft. She was also associated with the bird of uh, uh, the owl. You can see that here, and also the raven. You can see that here. Um, Now, Hecate was technically not actually a goddess. She was a titaness, one of the bands that fought a war against the gods. And she switched sides and fought for the gods. Um, but don't think of her as two faced. As a matter of fact, she had three faces, as this famous painting by William Blake shows. Shakespeare refers to her often as the triple Hecate. It's important to note that magic in this time period was a way of connecting man with the seasons, the divine, and also death. Things that before the advent of science, we had very few explanations for and craved more and more more and more knowledge of. The other great culture that influenced Macbeth is the Celts. The Celts were a culture that emigrated from Central Europe into the British Isles and occupied much of what is now Wales, Ireland, Scotland, and parts of England. Uh, the Celts were a pre-Christian tradition and had not and didn't have a very comprehensive written history. So a lot of what we know about them is passed on through oral traditions. But there are lots of myths that seem to point to the concepts of Macbeth. For starters, they were a warrior culture who believed in reincarnation, which might explain some of Macbeth's feelings towards killing the king. They also believed in use of cauldrons as symbols of resurrection and rebirth. There are Celtic rituals that emphasize this. Um, it's an important distinction. The Celts were the names of the people. The religious sect, the priestly class, were known as the Druids, who are even more um, shrouded in mystery than the Celts. Um, but we do have some myths, like I said, that have passed on, like Blodwyd, the maiden who was conceived of flowers and actually helped her lover overthrow the old Celtic king. And for her treason, she was turned into an owl. Owls are frequently associated with Lady Macbeth. Um, there we have a connection to this ancient Celtic myth. In addition, the frequently the Celts believed in a huge hierarchy of fairies and ghosts and spirits and sprites and all kinds of otherworldly creatures that would come in through misty and hollow places in the earth. Um, Not unlike the heath where Macbeth first meets the witches. Now, the best time to meet a ghost or a sprite or anything like that was on the Celtic festival of Samhain, which later evolved into modern day Halloween. So you can see how Halloween traditions are starting to creep into the stories that would later become Shakespeare's Macbeth. Um, on Samhain, the Celts believed that the spirits of the dead were able to visit, and they would celebrate by putting out food for the dead, but also lighting fires because not all the spirits were benevolent. There were wicked witches and wicked ghosts that wished to do them harm, so they would light fires and to protect themselves, and occasionally they would dress up in frightening costumes to scare the spirits away. So you see the origins of our trick or treating. A great preservation of these traditions. Um, a great way that modern British peoples have preserved these traditions is the Samhain Fire Society, in which still takes place in Scotland on October 31st. You'll notice in this video clip, I'm going to turn the sound off, but it is fascinating to watch. Uh, this was recorded in 2017, and you'll see people dressed up in costumes that resemble the natural spirits, but also fiery spirits, to once again honor the harvest of late fall, but also to frighten the approach of darkness and ward off the evil spirits that were thought to be prevalent at the onset of winter. It's not too much of a stretch to reimagine these characters as the witches in Macbeth or the fairies and sprites in A Midsummer Night's Dream. Now, I'm going to skip ahead here, not show the whole clip, but I'm going to skip to a very important part. Near the end of the video, you'll see two figures fighting with wooden sticks. This is a reenactment of an old myth. where the King of Winter defeats the old King of Summer with the help of the Kalak. Here we are. They fight each other to uh, assert the dominance of winter and the end of summer. Now, this sort of story of an old king defeated by a younger, more vigorous, and darker figure is at the heart of Shakespeare's Macbeth. So you can see that um, Macbeth has always had its ties to Halloween, and its mythic traditions run deep. Now, as Europe went Christian, magical traditions like this were, of course, taboo. They were not considered proper theology, but that doesn't mean that they were outlawed. Um, there was an ambivalent relationship in the Middle Ages between witchcraft um, uh, and Christianity. It was considered idolatrous, but it wasn't feared as it would be in later periods. Uh, in the early Tudor period, when Shakespeare's father was born, um, there were still wise women who lived in local communities who were viewed as witches, and sometimes they were persecuted, but not extensively. The laws at the time only really forbade conjuring devils or killing somebody with supernatural means. So you could practice your if you were a witch at the period, you could practice your cures and poultices and still not face any severe punishments. But all that changed after the death of Queen Elizabeth when King James I came to the throne. He was obsessed with witchcraft, and he viewed it as an existential threat to himself, to his reign, and all of Europe. Now, James, even before he became King of England, the he sat on councils of witch trials of over 70 people. There's a pamphlet called News from Scotland, which details how he tried women who reportedly tried to sink his ship as he tried to travel over to Denmark to marry Anne of Denmark. Um, and he tortured them mercilessly until they confessed in great detail how on Halloween they met with the devil and performed an ancient rite in order to join themselves into the devil's service. And James wrote about these incidents and many more in his book, The Demonology. So James heralded the change from witchcraft being an ambivalent source of nuisances and a holdover from a pre-Christian era. Now it was unquestionably and without exception, any form of witchcraft was the work of the devil and punishable by death. And this is why, once he took the throne, he ramped up all witch persecutions, and he made any form of witchcraft illegal. Why was James so obsessed with witchcraft? Well, it was partially because of the fact that he had suffered terrible luck in his family line. His father was assassinated, his mother was beheaded, um, and even considered a witch by the English Parliament. According to Stephen Greenblatt, James was just as worried about witchcraft as he was any other threat to his power. Now, Shakespeare might have gotten the idea to write Macbeth after an incident on August 27, 1605, when the king started his long progress through England to greet his subjects, where a playwright named Matthew Gwynne wrote a short speech for three boys dressed up as ancient Roman prophetesses. They stopped the king and proclaimed that he would have power without end, and called him a great lord of England, Ireland, Scotland, and France. Um, Now, the king was lukewarm um, to the piece, but I think Shakespeare must have gotten a hold of it and decided to play to James's fears of witchcraft, but at the same time re-emphasize that um, kings are protected to some extent by God. At the very least, James is protected because there's a speech where Macbeth looks at the line of Banquo and sees it stretching out into infinity. James claimed descendancy from the line of Banquo. So Macbeth simultaneously reinforces James' hatred of witchcraft and also reassures him that try as they might, they can never destroy his family line. As I said before, James published his findings on witchcraft in a book called The Daemonology, and this was influential in turning public opinion away from any form of witchcraft. And it did influence far beyond James's reign. James started persecuting witches as early as 1591. He ascended the throne in 1603 and started the Witchcraft Act of 1604. Shakespeare's company became the King's Men in 1605, the same year that James suffered an assassination attempt, where he claimed that he was inspired by God to foresee the plot and help thwart it. In 1621, James personally oversaw the trial of Elizabeth Sawyer. And in 1692 came the famous Salem witch trials in Salem, Massachusetts. So you can see how, even though witchcraft trials existed before James's reign, his reign was the turning point that where witchcraft was deeply feared and viewed as an existential threat to all of England and to all English colonies. Now, the witchcraft in Macbeth is interesting because it is highly ambiguous. Again, Shakespeare probably didn't want to portray witches as too powerful, lest he angered the king or make him too nervous. What Shakespeare does do is he makes the magic of the witches tantalizing and dangerous. It is a motif, first and foremost, a motif, again, of forbidden knowledge. Macbeth, the external threat of the witches is sort of a mirror of the internal violence and ambition and dark thoughts that lurk within Macbeth's soul. And many modern productions take this route, and certainly I did when I played Macbeth back in 2008. And the Malleus Maleficarum, The Witch's Hammer, a medieval pamphlet written by a German monk, devils can shape fantasies in people's minds. They can create what's called a local motion or interior temptation, leading people to see things that are not there, like daggers, for instance. This sort of interior temptation need not be demonic in nature. It might simply be the tortures of a overly stressed mind, or an or a person tormented by their own hidden desires. When I played Macbeth, I mostly ignored the witches. Um, believing that when they prophesy Macbeth will be king, they mostly just awoke feelings within himself, similar to the magic I just described. My overwhelming objective for Macbeth was to please his wife, and I believed that the couple had suffered unimaginable pain, and part of it was drawn by a textual inconsistency. In Act 1, Scene 7, Lady Macbeth says that she has given suck. She has nursed a baby. But in Act 4, Macduff reveals that Macbeth has no children. I therefore concluded that Macbeth and Lady Macbeth have lost a child, and this has caused unimaginable pain on the couple. And his desire for power is really a desire to try and satisfy her. And her desire for power is an attempt to fill the void that has been left by this missing child. I based a lot of this around my interpretation of Macbeth's soliloquy in Act 1, Scene 7. If it were done when 'tis done, then 'twere well it were done quickly. I noted that the language is extremely passive. Macbeth just wishes that Duncan would die, and then he could have the crown. He doesn't like the notion of killing someone with his own hands. And the more he thinks about it, the more terrifying imagery comes up. I'll start by delivering this speech. If it were done when 'tis done, then 'twere well it were done quickly. If the assassination could trammel up the consequence and catch with his surcease, success. But that this blow might be the be-all and the end-all here, but here, upon this bank and shoal of time, we jump the life to come. But in these cases we still have judgments here, that we but teach bloody instructions, which being taught return to plague the inventor. This even-handed justice commends the ingredients of our poisoned chalice to our own lips. He's here in double trust, first as I am his kinsman and his subject, strong both against the deed, then as his host, who should against his murderer shut the door, not bear the knife myself. Besides, this Duncan hath borne his faculties so meek, hath been so clear in his great office, that his virtues will plead like angels, trumpet-tongued against the deep damnation of his taking off. And pity, like a naked newborn babe striding the blast, or heaven's cherubim horsed upon the sightless couriers of the air, shall blow the horrid deed in every eye, that tears shall drown the wind. To the right is the painting that William Blake painted about this section of the text, where pity is shown as a naked newborn babe, and heaven's cherubim, angels, are horsed and flying through the air. Macbeth sees eyes judging him everywhere for this crime. He is afraid of inciting divine wrath, and also judicial wrath, because, of course, if he kills the king, what's to stop him from being killed? I have no spur to prick the sides of my intent, but only vaulting ambition, which o'erleaps itself and falls on the other. You can see in this shot of me, I'm certainly not spurred. I'm sitting down, just talking to the audience. I have no motivation to get up and go to the king's chamber and kill him, which is why in the text, the next line is Lady Macbeth entering, so that she can spur him to murder. It is important to note that the witches can be a manifestation of Macbeth's tortured soul. A lot has been made of in recent years about the concept of Macbeth perhaps having PTSD. As I said in the earlier slide, in the Malleus Maleficarum, witches were thought to bring out desires and make people see things that they are not seeing. Well, in PTSD, there is a heightened state of alertness, a sense of seeing the things that were not there, seeing threats that are not there, and panic at the slightest noises. Similar to Macbeth's line in the famous Dagger soliloquy, where he says, "How is't with me that every sound appalls me? Thou sure and firm set earth, hear not my steps which way they walk." He's afraid of even the slightest creak that his footfalls make. Clearly, this man is heightened, has a heightened imagination and heightened senses. He also sees things that aren't there, daggers. Now, it's interesting to me that Macbeth has this heightened awareness, but also King James did. According to documents at the time, even though King James was a skilled hunter, he would never learn how to fence because even the sight of a blade would throw him into a panic. And don't forget, his father was assassinated and his mother was beheaded. So I suspect that possibly Macbeth's heightened awareness might have had ties to King James himself. It's interesting how Macbeth tantalizes the king's fears, but but does it from a safe distance. Again, the witches tantalize Macbeth with their wickedness, but they have very little direct action on the play. And this sort of looking at fearful stuff at a distance is sort of similar to what we do when we watch a good horror movie. Um, John Carpenter, the director of Halloween, says that there's two types of horror: the internal and the external. He used the metaphor of a man sitting around a campfire telling a story about two different types of evil. The other tribe, the people who are out to get us, is one. The other story is the evil that's in our hearts. And a good horror story is about both. And Macbeth certainly fits the bill there, because it is both about the fear of witches tearing down the crown from the outside, and also the fear of Macbeth tearing himself apart from within. And Macbeth itself has become an iconic part of horror and later Halloween itself. Shakespeare didn't invent the trope of the Wicked Witch, but he did popularize it, again, using the fears of the time, of this great shift in the 17th century. He redefined how a witch looks, talks, and acts. Think of any witch you see. Think of how they probably speak. I can't tell you how many different witches I've seen in popular culture that quote at least the famous line, "Double, double, toil and trouble, fire burn and cauldron bubble." The language is very specific and very unique. Nobody in all of Shakespeare talks like the witches, whereas most characters speak in iambic pentameter. The witches speak in trochaic tetrameter, a weird it is literally offbeat language. And as you can see in these two pages here, in one of them I have quotes from the witches, and on the right I have a real incantation from a modern Wiccan ceremony. And you'll notice that they're both rhyming couplets of around 7 to 8 syllables. Perhaps Shakespeare even inspired real witches to change the way that they speak. And it doesn't stop there. Think of the iconic phrases that have come as a response to Macbeth. From movies, Double, Double, Toil and Trouble, to the use of the cauldron and in its ingredients like Eye of Newt, to the famous line, "Something wicked this way comes." Macbeth redefined the terror of the witch and found its way into many ways in which we speak of the fear of the unknown. Halloween is at a time when we consider what makes us afraid. As the sun dies, every culture on Earth has to deal with the onset of winter and the oncoming darkness. So it's a good time to think about what makes us afraid. More importantly, how we deal with fear. There's a great story by R.L. Stine in the Goosebumps books where a little girl is tired of being afraid and tired of being scared by other people on Halloween. So she buys a terrifying mask, and slowly her personality starts to change the more she wears it. She becomes more of a bully. She becomes crueler. She becomes a monster. Macbeth has the same arc. He, for whatever reason, whether it's fear of his wife, fear of dying, fear of the horrors he's seen in war, he becomes a murderous, usurping monster. But I think that fear motivates his decisions more than anything else. His fear doesn't diminish with his cruelty, it only grows. And witchcraft is once again a metaphor for what we fear, what excites us, and what we desire to know, even though we shouldn't. Which is why the play is inextricably tied to the time where we ask these questions. Halloween.